Alright, good evening. It is February 17th. This is episode 3 of the February live stream for Mike Makes Stuff Patreon patrons. I've got my Dunkin' Donuts, a treat for the week, and we are getting started again here with the Black History Month piece. I was able to find some reference, and of course the physical comics, for Shuri, T'Challa's sister, who's featured right over here on the left, and for Monica Rambeau Spectrum, who's one of the coolest characters in the Ultimates right now. I didn't like a lot of her old costume and I had to go hunt those down, but they finally appeared to have made it onto Google. And as you can tell, I've done some work in the past week on this. Like I said before, I do it often. Moon Girl might be a little bit small. Shuri and Falcon are quite a bit more developed than they were last week. I went and got a new model for Spectrum because I wasn't really digging where she was headed. But the anatomy on everything's pretty solid now, with the exception of one or two areas that I'm probably going to leave to the end. And things like Spectrum's thigh and Shuri's hips, which I'd like to bolster a little bit. Otherwise, it's starting to come together, and we're looking at moving out of the concept and referencing phase and more into the solid penciling phase. What you'll watch me do mostly for the next hour is pick a specific figure, hone it in, and really work out most of the parts here. I think what I'm going to do largely today is Falcon. He's pretty well advanced. Getting him finished will really help ground the piece and give me an idea of how far I want to develop other parts of the piece before moving on. And that'll kind of set the groundwork for what's going to happen. Looking at how far we are into the month and how complex this piece is, I think it'll probably end as an inked piece, given its level of complexity, and then maybe I'll come back later this year and decide to put colors through it. I'm not as confident in my coloring ability as I am in my line art and inking, and most of my time is being spent these days on drawing, not on painting or coloring anyway, so better to keep it there. Normally I'd want to finish such an important figure as Panther here, but I've noticed a couple of things that I want to change relative to the reference. So this is the reference that I'm using. Again, this is a $200 model that Marvel sells, and this version of the helmet may actually be more detailed than the ones they use in the film. I'm not 100% sure. But as you can see, this really follows the muscle in the eyebrow here. And I believe that where I have those lines coming is a little bit high. Bringing that down is going to help reinforce the impression of his expression on the skull. And then here, with this on the cheekbone, it's also a little too high. It could stand to come down a little bit. And those are minor in the degree of the change, but I think they'll overall create a much more powerful impression of the structure of the helmet, the expression, the tilt of the head, things that are very important for making that part of the piece really pop. Because it's so symmetrical and so geometrical, it's easy to look at that and say, okay, that's refined and finished, and it's certainly tempting to leave it the way it is rather than to fix it. But I think doing that would be ultimately a disservice to the entire piece, and what's the point in doing it if you're not going to do it right, particularly when you don't actually have a hard deadline. So I'm going to shut off some of these distracting layers here. I'm going to keep Black Panther, and we're going to focus on Falcon for a while. Falcon is an interesting character in that his movie persona largely plays the sidekick role. He does a lot of really cool stuff, but he never really looks that cool. He doesn't have the stage presence of some of the other characters, and that's definitely true in the comics as well. Not that I follow Falcon that closely in the comics. Anybody who's listening to this, which I'm sure there's all of zero of you, who can recommend a really great Falcon comic where he's super cool and badass, that'd be great, and I'd love to read it. My goal with him here is to kind of take the elements of his design that I like the most and make something that I think looks really badass in its own right. This is a nice design overall. And I see what they're doing here, but for some reason it just doesn't click for me. This is a nice design as well, but the baggy clothing underneath really seems to detract from it for me. I get that they're army fatigues and it's a reference to the origin of his exosuit, but it just kind of makes him look puffy under there, and that doesn't really work. Unfortunately, that's probably the best example of the kind of clothing he would need to wear if he were doing any of these weather-based ops. Any of these air-based operations. One of the things that I don't like about a lot of these designs is the exposed face and upper arms. If you're flying around, it gets cold. One of the running jokes is that any character who has the power of flight also has the power of friction resistance, and improved reflexes and all this other stuff. I can't imagine why you would leave that part of your arms exposed. It doesn't really accomplish anything. With his face, maybe there's a little bit of an argument, but I feel like even so, he wears goggles to protect his eyes, but he doesn't wear anything to protect his mouth or anything. We're probably not going to mess with that here, but as you can see, I've expanded and added some more detail onto this. I'd really like to see something that worked more like Star-Lord's helmet, where you can, engage it more completely. But I don't know. This exposed upper arm thing definitely gives me the impression that he's like just off the JV squad. It doesn't look complete. So I'm going to work with that here and trying to create a costume here that just looks a little bit more complete and comprehensive. doing something here that I probably shouldn't be doing. I've been called out by some of my mentors for this a couple of times. In that I have a tendency to ink while I pencil, which is great if you don't plan on actually inking. Or you can do fun things like just, duplicate the layer, which I can do here. But it also helps me give an idea of if things still work after I've adjusted something or reduced something. And it also makes things look more complete. So I have a tendency to do that almost as a security measure for myself to say, yeah, that's gonna look right the way I want it to. You see that I did that down here. It's a lot looser, but it lets me say, okay, that's kind of what this is gonna look like when this is finished. I don't have to worry so much. Things here are still pressure sensitive, so there's lighter grays and stuff like that. When I go and do inks, a lot of that's gone, and I'm really looking for a cleaner, more clarified line, even more than what I've accomplished here. So I will still probably go through the inking process, particularly because inking is very relaxing and cathartic, at least for me. So one of the assumptions I'm operating under with this quasi redesign of Falcon is that he's flying purely under the power of this flight suit, and that he's consistently making modifications to it. He's the Iron Man of his personal flight suit, which, based on at least some of the comics that I've read, is not entirely out of line. It's a little bit bigger than the body we had set up for him originally, and certainly looks pretty big compared to his waist. I like the idea that there's technology outside of the wings that helps him here. So I'm building out some of the back to kind of suggest that that's there, and also, increasing the rigidness of some of these shapes. I want it to look like he can fly, and not in the sense that Superman can fly. But I also don't want it to look like he's wearing a jetpack, because jetpacks are impractical and dangerous. I also like this idea that it's built more into his torso, because it creates a more reasonable sense of haptics. That the suit's going to be able to anticipate how he moves, and thus the direction he wants to go, as opposed to just flinging him in one direction. He's got to manipulate things with his arms. As always, there's some suspension of disbelief, but the easier I can make it, the better. That is a good donut. read the blog post this week. I mentioned famous comic book artist Brian Hitch, who is probably my single biggest influence in terms of wanting to draw and sticking with drawing comics. And I read, can't remember the name of the book, but he did a book about drawing comics, and it's not really about figure work or anatomy or anything like that, but really more about storytelling and stuff. So it's not a great place to start out with if you don't have an art background. But one of the things he mentions is one of the best ways to make sure that your person looks right is to make sure that you get the seams on their clothes correct. And that's a really great way to do that, because seams follow a lot of the center lines on the body. So like if he was wearing a t-shirt, he would have his center line here. You guys see the cursor? You don't see the cursor. So for example, a seam would be here on a t-shirt, and you'd have another one roughly here, and then usually well, there's one on the inside on t-shirt sleeves. T-shirts don't have a lot of seams, but getting those seams right helps do that a lot. And one of the reasons I mention that is because there's a lot of piping that I'm putting in on the costume here, and it kind of reinforces where the bicep is, where the end of the sleeve is, where his elbow is. And as you can see here, what I'm basically doing is just extending his sleeve. I'm keeping this piping here to suggest a sleeve, but I'm not really sticking with it. I would imagine that if I were to color this in, this would all be material that covers him. Again, why would his elbow be exposed? this idea to build out this breastplate bit and create something that looks like it might generate thrust from the front here. So there's kind of this annulus over which air can be pushed. Generate thrust from the front of his suit as well as from the back. I don't necessarily know about this part here. I'm really referencing this here. I don't know if that actually looks any good. I may rest on that and come back to it. Let's leave that alone. That looks like it would generate drag and not be all that useful. But it kind of looks weird without it. So this is another one of those situations where a lot of the comic costumes feature the same element, and I just can't quite wrap my mind around it. Go back to the reference file in a second. If you look, not this one, this one's pretty good, but here he's got exposed fingertips, he's got exposed fingertips, he's got exposed fingertips, and maybe that's great if he's doing dexterity work, but if it's windy outside and my fingers are out, they're pretty damn cold, and that's only going to be true if you're flying. So I like the idea that maybe his gloves change in material here from something that's thicker to something that's a little bit thinner and more easily manageable. It really doesn't make a difference except for when I go to color it. And I'm sure you noticed that I left the hand towards the end here, and that was not a mistake. I was avoiding it because hands and faces are just so easy to ruin. Give him some buttons to press. I always assume there are buttons to press to do cool shit. So then the challenge becomes cleaning this up and clearing out the rest of the hand so that it still makes sense. I think the knuckles look good. I gotta work on the rest of it. My dog is objecting to the presence of neighbors. I don't know if you guys can hear that. drawing these little vents in all over his costume, and I kind of think of them as a way for him to open or shut them and control how much air is moving through his chest piece and control speed and whatever. I don't know. It makes sense in my head. And I'd say he's looking pretty sharp at this point. I don't want to do a whole lot of shading because I need to figure out exactly where the light source is and stuff like that. And I'm not super sure about his face yet. The head in general is good. I want him to look a bit more, like again, using this one for example, he's supposed to look really badass and imposing, and for some reason it's just not selling for me. So kind of like this a little bit more, at least for me. I'm gonna put some aviation references at least on the jetpack element here. Some actual jets. Imagine smaller ones, because a giant one would just, be unmanageable. And some flaps. As you can see, I've kind of done a very loose outline of the wings here, and I'm probably going to cut the stream shorter at this point, largely because I'm not sure what I want to do with the wings, and there's going to be some experimentation, and it's going to be messy, and I'm probably going to do it on another layer. As you can see here, he's got very geometrical wings, and there's that texture that refers back to this. And this one's got some elements of this one that I like. It's going to require some messing around. This one is a pretty big diversion with some more clear exoskeletal stuff. And I originally was planning on having his wing extending from underneath his arm, like this. And that created a really interesting motion. However, the problem with that was that it covers most of his torso, which I didn't think was going to create the imposing impression I wanted. I was going to, ignore all this, and it was really going to be about, hey, look, he has bird arms. So we're about 45 minutes, an hour further into the drawing now. And I think at this point, Falcon is probably more complete than Panther is. We'll probably complete Falcon before going back to Panther or any of the other characters. He creates a real solid impression of where this is going. And I think at this point, just the face maybe and definitely the wings. So thanks for tuning in. I may stream again before next Friday. If nothing else, it will definitely be next Friday. I'm going to try and maintain that. And if you're enjoying the streams, comment, like, subscribe, share, encourage other folks to tune in. Once February is over, streams will be on a delay for the public, and there will be streams that are only for Patreon users. So remember that a lot of what I'm posting this month is only accessible because I'm sharing it for the month of February to increase traffic. So hopefully you're enjoying it and are willing to part with $1 a month to continue to support my work. Thanks for tuning in. This is Mike Makes Stuff.